Okay, let's talk about funding. So there are a lot of different sources, types of social investment, and we're going to break it down, starting with sources. Where does money come from? If you think about different sources of funding that are available to you at this stage, you can start with government funding. Many governments have programs for entrepreneurship and for research and development. These often go to established institutions, so it's helpful to partner with a university or other organization that's doing research if you're using this for your proof of concept and development stage. There's also multilateral organizations like World Bank, UN, where multiple governments come together and form funds, and they view entrepreneurship as a form of international development and sustainable development. So there are definitely many contests and awards that you can apply to from these institutions, fostering entrepreneurship at early stage ideas or even scaling existing organizations. Then there's non-governmental organizations, and these will be either local to the setting that you're in. They could be local NGOs or they could be international NGOs. Some of the bigger names you might have heard of are like Oxfam and Mercy Corps. And these support social entrepreneurs both financially and non-financially. So they might give you technical support too. Other sources of funding are foundations. Again, these can be local or international. And funds, which, unlike foundations, are usually for-profit. There are different types of funds, and we'll talk about these a little bit when we talk about the different social investment approaches and types of funding. And last but not least, there are individuals, which could be angel investors and philanthropists that give large amounts, or they could be individuals that give small amounts, like you can do crowdfunding, or raise funds from friends and family in order to do your first proof of concept. Of course, there's advantages and disadvantages to all these different sources of working with all these different sources of funding, and it really depends on what's the best match for you, and we talk about that a lot in chapter 10. Last but not least, there's corporate funding. There's corporate social responsibility or CSR funds that can go out to people external from the company, or it could be in the company that you work in. There could be innovation funds available. Now, the way that you go about accessing these funds depends not only on the source, but also the type of funds. So if you're accessing from individuals, you may be able to access donations, which is when someone gives you a fixed amount of money and doesn't really ask for anything in return. Now, when that amount of money gets larger and is given by an institution, then we call it a grant. A grant does come with strings attached, even if you don't need to give the money back, but you need to do a lot of reporting and provide a very detailed budget, and they really want to keep track of the impact. And that's how a lot of the multilateral agencies, NGOs, and government sources of funding operate, and foundations as well. And again, there are advantages and disadvantages of each. So grants are larger amounts than you might get from crowdfunding, but at the same time, entrepreneurs spend so much time writing proposals and reports and everything. Awards are something kind of in between, where they might be larger amounts, where there are no less strings attached, and you need to participate in a contest for those. There are contests at most universities on social entrepreneurship, and you don't have to be a student at that university. You can just partner with a student at that university, which could help you on multiple fronts. So those are the types of funding where you don't need to give it back. Then there's loans and equity. And loans and equity are more appropriate for social ventures that are going to be able to generate surplus revenue, whether you register as for-profit or non-profit. But the important thing is that you're definitely going to be able to break even and generate more revenue than your costs. So a loan, most of you are familiar with it. It's when an individual or institution gives you funds that you have to repay. So the downside of that is that you have to repay it even if you aren't able to make the money. You're still liable. The upside of that is that it has less strings attached in the sense of their role in your decision making. Equity, on the other hand, an individual or institution, and a lot of the accelerators and incubators I mentioned in the last segment will do this. They'll provide you with funding and other resources, and in return, they'll own a small percentage of your company. And so they'll be able to weigh in on decisions. And so those are the advantages or disadvantages. Now, when you first start out, you're going to just be raising a small amount of money to do your proof of concept. Once you do that, once you're able to do your pilot and to demonstrate your impact, then you'll apply for a Series A round where you're raising a large amount of money to actually roll it out. And then you might do a Series B round and further when you're expanding. And you might find yourself graduating along these different sources and types of funding as you proceed. And so it's important to think about not only the characteristics of your solution and your organization, but also your own personal characteristics. For example, some people feel very comfortable raising that seed fund amount for their proof of concept from friends and family, while others feel that they don't feel comfortable telling these people, this is money you might never see again if this doesn't work. And we all know that entrepreneurship is risky and that they might not ever see that money again. So it really depends on you, your risk tolerance, and the culture you're creating in your organization. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about social investment approaches. So these different types of funding are really aligned with different approaches in funding. For example, crowdfunding will mostly have donations, although sometimes you can crowdfund loans and equity, but this is less rare and more recent. Philanthropy is usually when people or institutions are giving you or lending you the money in order to see the social impact. So while they want you to generate revenue, they're not necessarily asking you to give it back. And there's different kinds of philanthropy that we go through, including strategic, catalytic, and venture philanthropy, which is kind of like venture capital, but instead of investing in commercial entrepreneurs, they're investing in social entrepreneurs. So they want to measure that social return on investment, or SROI, rather than the financial ROI. Impact investing takes it one step further, where they're measuring the social impact and they also want to measure the financial return and they want some of that back. So that's going to be more valid for the for-profit social ventures. And last but not least, there's socially responsible investing, which speaks to the traditional form of investing that really want to focus on companies that don't do damage rather than companies that produce positive impact. So this is really the spectrum of investment approaches that corresponds with the spectrum of social entrepreneurship. Because what is social entrepreneurship in the end? It's really everything filling in that space between traditional charity and traditional commerce. And so the types of investment and sources really corresponds with that. What I've done is I've created for you a resource dashboard on page 196 that helps you organize the information about these different sources and types of funding and the investment approaches. And this is something that you can recreate electronically in an Excel sheet or a Word doc or whatever, where you make different phases of your venture, starting with the proof of concept, which is just what you need to make a working prototype or pilot test your services, and then the launch, in terms of, okay, we're really doing this now, which is, like we spoke about earlier, just a bunch of different, it's like multiplying the pilots, and then the growth, which is usually for after you break even. And so this helps you organize both financial and non-financial support needed, like expertise needed and people to talk to, funding needed and prospective funders for each stage, and the targets and tools and resources needed for each target. And the reason for this is that oftentimes you're going to come across so many sources of funding and resource people, and it's very important, timing is very important. You have to wait until you're ready for that source or that type, and you also want to keep track of this information so that you'll have it there when you're at that stage. So keep track of what your product or service looks like at each stage so that you'll know when you're ready.